открываем, я надеюсь, досрочный совместный проект с партнерами. Я представляю Институт стратегии устойчивого развития, недавно появившуюся некоммерческую организацию в Санкт-Петербурге. И данный проект – это партнерский проект с Национальным исследовательским университетом Тема и кафедрой технологии предпринимательства и инноваций, который здесь у нас представлен. Это партнерская программа с фондом Энергетика и некоторыми нашими информационными партнерами. Они все у нас были обозначены на наших объявлениях и плакатах. Я вас всех приветствую, потому что мы начинаем новый проект «Социальные науки и практика в области устойчивого развития». И первая часть нашего проекта будет посвящена нашему знакомству с экспертами, представляющими знания в этой области из Германии. И в данном случае я хочу поприветствовать нашего лектора, сегодняшнюю нашу гостью, директора Центра экологической политики Свободного университета Берлина, профессора, советника правительства Германии, госпожу Миранду Шрёз. Сейчас я передам ей слово. Я надеюсь, что вы будете и участниками наших дальнейших проектов. Мы обязательно будем информировать вас о них. По поводу сегодняшнего нашего ивента я хочу сказать, что лекция наша будет до 18 часов. Затем мы приглашаем вас всех на кофе-брейк. И после кофе-брейка будет брифинг для журналистов, на котором вы тоже можете все присутствовать. И модератором брифинга будет представитель тоже нашей партнерской организации Ангелина Давыдова. Это русско-немецкий бюро экологической информации. Русско-немецкое бюро экологической информации. Поэтому я приветствую вас всех. Надеюсь, что будет сегодня интересно. И два слова
университету ТМО. Я прошу всех сесть, чтобы все чувствовали себя комфортно. Пожалуйста, все, кто стоят, те, кто не относится к нашей команде, которая помогает организовывать, я очень прошу сесть, потому что здесь есть места. Мы будем сейчас всех ждать. Ну что случилось? Я объясню, почему Национальный исследовательский университет информационных технологий, механики и оптики занимается проблемами sustainable development, проблемами урбанистики. Дело в том, что вот в этом здании замечательном купца Елисеева, мы сейчас в бальном зале, или как он называется, концертный зал иногда, купца Елисеева, мы находимся здесь на мансарде в 14-м доме. У нас то, что мы называем сейчас свободное пространство, которое состоит из Open Studio для урбанистических проектов, из инкубатора для стартапов и кафедры технологического предпринимательства и управления инновациями, которую я представляю. Программу по урбанистике, которую мы сегодня здесь вам презентуем в виде только такого маленького информационного стенда, на самом деле в ней все дело. И лекция Миранды тоже состоится в рамках, ну вот для нас, да, как организаторов, магистерской программы «Дизайн городских экосистем», которая запущена с сентября года прошлого у нас на нашей кафедре. Поэтому есть очень много интересных вещей, которые происходят в рамках этой магистратуры. Постоянно действующее пространство для дискуссии на тему урбанистики в ее современном понимании, которое называется «Про-урбан». И очень много всего. Я приглашаю всех посетить наши ресурсы в сети интернет, про которые мы, наверное, сможем сказать на брифинге чуть более подробно. И понять, что мы являемся благодарной площадкой, на которой мы готовы принять достаточно много интересных людей, организовать дискуссию, организовать круглый стол, пригласить людей, которые в этом заинтересованы в качестве слушателей и экспертов. Поэтому прошу всех присоединяться к нашему такому движению, которое здесь началось на нашей кафедре. И нам очень нравится, что это движение сопровождается двумя такими трендами, да, с двух сторон. С одной стороны, это урбанистика, с другой стороны, это инновационное предпринимательство и стартапы. В нашем случае они соединяются, потому что у нас очень много проектов для городской среды, а урбанистику мы, безусловно, понимаем в самом широком смысле этого слова. И не хочу здесь об этом больше говорить, хочу, чтобы вы посмотрели по ресурсам, по нашим презентациям, что мы, собственно, делаем, и тогда вы поймете, что нам уже есть чем гордиться. Приглашаю всех присоединяться к тому, что мы здесь делаем. Спасибо.
Итак, мы предоставляем слово профессору Миранде Шрёз. И тема нашей сегодняшней лекции — энергетическая политика в Европе, Японии, Соединенных Штатах Америки, взгляд на возобновляемые источники энергии, атомную энергетику и сланцевый газ. Лекция пройдет, будет предоставлена возможность задать вопросы. Я надеюсь, что у нас будет интересная и живая дискуссия. И, соответственно, прошу, Миранду.
Thank you very much for your warm welcome to the beautiful city of St. Petersburg. I know that the room has some Dutch people sitting in it. I can tell you my name is actually a Dutch name, Miranda Šrёz, but I grew up in New York, and I've lived in Germany since 2007, so I consider myself a bit of an international traveler. And I also have, as a result, lots of international perspectives on environment and energy questions. And I would be very happy today to also have a conversation with you about the relationship with Russia, because I think right now especially it's a very important question for us to be thinking about. How do we all move forward together on energy questions, and how do we do it in such a way that we also address the planetary problems that we have? Everything from energy poverty in some parts of the world, to climate change, to environmental degradation. So I'd like to talk with you and also hear your views about these questions. Maybe I can begin by telling you a little bit of this situation in the European Union right now, where in Europe we have had developments for some time thinking about what can be done to change the energy structure in the European context. And these discussions began in relationship to the problem of climate change. It began in part with the Kyoto Protocol, when Europe agreed that it would try to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 8% of 1990 levels by 2012. And then some years ago, Europe said we need to do a little bit more, and Europe came up with a plan, which is very nice to say in English, 20-20-20 by 2020. It's the plan for 20% greenhouse gas emission reductions, 20% renewable energy, 20% energy efficiency improvements, all by 2020. But of course, 2020 isn't very far away. And so when we're thinking about how do we go beyond 2020, beyond these 20-20-20 goals, we have to think what comes next. In Europe, the 20-20-20 goals are divided by country so that different countries have different expectations related to their responsibilities for helping Europe move in the direction of a low-carbon society. So we have countries like Sweden, which is already getting a very large percentage of its electricity from hydropower, and therefore has a fairly high percentage of electricity from renewables, that has a goal to increase that by about 5%, so that they become almost half renewable energy by 2020. And in Germany, which doesn't have so much hydropower, and the focus is much more on developing renewables out of new renewable energy, out of wind and out of solar. There's a target for 18% by 2020. So this is what Europe is doing right now, country by country, and it's had some impacts. If you take a look at where Europe was back in 1990, which is here, this is where emissions were. And then right about here we get the Kyoto Protocol, and we see emissions are dropping. This is the financial crisis. We see that Europe has had some progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Some of this, especially this first part here, we call it fall of the wall problem. Fall of the Berlin Wall, it's the transition from the older economies of the socialist era to the transition towards a more capitalized and modernized economic structure. But much of this drop afterwards is a drop that can be associated with the policies to promote renewable energy, energy efficiency, and a shift in the economies of Europe in a direction of a more climate-friendly structure. Europe's goal is now going beyond. It's looking for a vision for what Europe might look like in 30 years' time. The young people in this room, that's your future. What could Europe look like? We could ask the same about Russia. What might be possible in 2050? And if we listen to the warnings about climate change, then the industrialized states have to reduce their emissions very dramatically. Europe is trying to move in the direction of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 80 to 95% by 2050. Think about that for a minute. That's an energy revolution. That's taking us out of a structure that was established in the 1850s, when we began industrialization based on coal, and then we added oil, and we added gas, and we structured our societies on fossil fuels. The question is it possible to transition away in a direction that is low carbon and more environmentally friendly? Europe right now is in the middle of negotiations about what could come next. What is the target for 2030? If we want to have an energy revolution by 2050, then we need to be thinking about what needs to be done in the medium term. We already have the 20-20-20 targets for 2020. But what about 2030? Those are the discussions in Europe right now. At the moment, it's not yet decided. The European Commission has proposed 40, 27, something by 2030. 40% greenhouse gas emission reductions, 27% renewables in the energy mix, and improvements in energy efficiency. Very interestingly, the European Parliament responded to the European Commission and said, that doesn't go far enough. And the European Parliament has proposed that the targets be 40, 30, 40 by 2020. So the European Parliament would like to see more renewables in the mix, and they would like to see more energy efficiency in the target. We still don't know what the final decision will be, because negotiations are still going on among the member states of Europe, and there are some differences of opinion. Germany would easily push for 40, 30, 40. Some other countries are perhaps a little bit less advanced with their renewables and are a little bit more worried about the transition. So right now the negotiations are still ongoing, but we see a general direction in Europe towards greater use of renewable energy. And in Germany, we're trying to put a new word into the global vocabulary called the Energiewende. The Energiewende basically means the energy turnaround, the energy transition. I like to call it the energy revolution. The Energiewende, the energy transition. Is it possible to move us away from old energies towards new energies? Why is this such a big issue for Europe? Why is Europe pushing on energy issues in this way? Well, maybe a big difference with Russia and Europe is that Europe is heavily dependent on energy imports. So Europe is getting, at this moment in time, about 58% of its energy imported into Europe. And the costs of different kinds of energy have been rising. Sometimes they dropped. Financial crisis, they dropped a little bit when there was less demand for energy. But Europe is nervous about rising fossil fuel prices. And if you think about it, Europe's an expensive place to do business. It has high standard of living, it has high labor costs, and if energy costs are expensive as well, it's a competitive problem also for Europe. So Europe right now is pushing from an economic perspective to think about what can be done to reduce dependency on energy imports and to make production more efficient. Of course, resource imports are one of the most expensive parts of producing anything. This is the situation in Germany. Germany is about 1/3 of the European economy. So what Germany does is very important. England is also very important in terms of the economic impacts for all of Europe. And actually both England and Germany are two of the countries that are pushing quite hard for this energy transition. If we look at primary energy use in Germany, and what share of that comes from Germany and what share comes from imports, we see that Germany has to import almost all of its mineral oil. It only has 2% of its own mineral oil. Natural gas. Germany is importing 86% of its natural gas, and about 1/3 of that is coming from Russia. In terms of hard coal, that's the cleaner of the two forms of coal, it's also having to import a lot. It imports all of its uranium, and it's only brown coal, lignite, which is a very dirty form of coal that it has a lot of, and renewable energy. So if you think about it from a German perspective, and also true for many other European countries, in terms of economic future, there's a lot of reason to be thinking about what can be done with more renewables. Economics is one argument, but there's also the climate change argument. If we look at the recent warnings from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there's a very strong global consensus among scientists that climate change is real, that climate change is starting to be felt, that it will have impacts in all regions on the world. And although we can't indicate that this winter is a particularly warm winter in Europe because of climate change, there's enough things going on that the warning signs are there. And we have already hit the stage of 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. 400 parts per million is well above the level of what we had at the time the Industrial Revolution began. When the Industrial Revolution began, we were at about 280 parts per million. And so we have been pushing very, very fast, and most of that increase has been in the last 20 years. 450 parts per million is considered a 2-degree average temperature increase on the planet. So one of our questions is, how do we prevent this from going up to 450 parts per million? Germany, in many ways, is one of the countries in Europe, but certainly not the only one, that is pushing hard on an energy transition, the Energiewende. And it might be interesting just to hear a little bit about what's going on there. In 2010, the governments introduced a climate and energy package. And the climate and energy package has as its goal an 80 to 95% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And to get there, Germany is talking about reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2020. Remember I told you 2020 by 2020? Europe is getting to 2020 in part because Germany is doing 40% greenhouse gas emission reductions, and the same with England. So if you have a couple of countries with big targets, then we can start to see the potential impact for the entire European region to start on an energy transition. So Germany's minus 40% target in 2010 is supposed to increase to 55% by 2030 and 70% by 2040. That's not very long in the future. This means the decisions being made today determine where we are in a few years' time. And to get there, it means a lot of renewable energy in the electricity sector, basically taking the electricity sector, which is now primarily coal-based, and shifting it to renewables, so that by 2050 it's 80% renewables. And the entire energy system, 60% renewables. If we did that without also improving energy efficiency, it would mean an awful lot of new wind parks and an awful lot of solar panels and an awful lot of new grid infrastructure. And most people don't want so much of that. So the other thing we need to focus on a lot is how do you reduce the amount of energy you use, energy efficiency improvements, so that you don't need as much new infrastructure. Maybe the other interesting thing, especially from a Russian perspective, is in order to get a system with a lot of renewable energy, you also need to have a backup. And gas is probably the best backup for renewable energy. On the days when there's no wind and there's no sun, natural gas is where you turn if you want to do it low carbon rather than coal. So there is some potential for working together. There's a new government in Germany. The new government came into power only at the end of last year. So the new government has introduced its own small changes to the energy plan, but basically the energy plan remains the same. The difference is now they're talking about maybe by 2025 we can do 40 to 45% renewable energy. By 2035, maybe 55 to 60% renewable energy. The same general trajectory. The third reason Germany is doing an energy transition, and Europe less so. When I say the nuclear question, Europe's more divided. In 2011, in March, there was a large nuclear explosion at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. I used to live in Japan. I lived in Japan for 5 years, and I lived very close to this nuclear power plant. So when this happened, it certainly woke me up. And after the nuclear accident in Japan, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, introduced probably the world's first committee to look at nuclear energy from an ethical perspective. An ethical committee to evaluate, should Germany continue with nuclear energy, yes or no? After the Fukushima nuclear accident, Germany started to reconsider what should be done with Germany's nuclear power plants. In the past, Germany was the world's 4th largest nuclear capacity country. It has now made a decision to shut down all of its nuclear power plants. It's actually the 2nd time Germany's making this decision. The first time was in 2001. It was caused by the Chernobyl nuclear accident. It took a long time to make the political decision to phase out of nuclear. In 2010, just before the Fukushima accident, the government said, maybe we'll keep our nuclear power plants a little bit longer. But then the Fukushima accident changed that, and Germany has again decided to phase out nuclear energy. So the energy transition, the Energiewende in Germany, is a double transition. It's a transition out of nuclear energy and a transition away from heavy reliance on fossil fuels. So when I say energy revolution, that's what I'm talking about. It's trying to create a new energy structure underlying our economy and our society, which is one of the most exciting projects I've ever worked on. I heard you guys in the urban space just a little while ago talking about what can be done in Kronstadt. What you guys are doing in Kronstadt, we're trying to do at a country level here. And maybe at a European, and eventually we want to get Russia on board, maybe we can do a transition for the future, do it together. But what does it take? Right now, Germany's still kind of trying to figure out how to do a lot of it by itself. We know that we need more wind parks. And just like you have a lot of coast, Germany has some coast here, and there's a lot of wind potential. So some idea about offshore wind. Northern Germany has already got a lot of wind power. On a good windy day in Germany, Germany gets 50% of its electricity from wind alone. And solar panels. Maybe amount of sunshine in St. Petersburg is not all that different from the amount of sunshine in many parts of Germany. Germany is not the sunniest place in the world. But Germany has half of the world's photovoltaic panels installed. And on a good sunny day, Germany is getting 40 to 50% of its electricity during peak hours from sun. So when you've got wind and when you've got sun, we are already well on the way to that energy transition. There are, however, days when there's no wind and there's no sun. So then you start to think about what else can we have for those kinds of days? Is it possible to use biomass? To a point it is. But too much biomass also has problems for agriculture. It takes away land from crop use, biodiversity concerns. So probably biomass will be a part of the solution, but not a big part of the solution. Here's an area where we need to do a lot more research. Is it possible to somehow store wind and solar electricity in battery systems or in high-pressure air storage systems? Is it possible to take electric power and turn it into gas? Power to gas? That's the technological challenge we're putting on the engineers to try to figure out how do we store the sun? How do we store the wind for those days when we don't have it? And maybe we can also work with neighbors that have mountainous regions and a lot of water. Norway already has 100% of its electricity from hydropower. And you can technically, believe it or not, you can have on a really windy day, take that wind and pump the water up a hill and store it in a dam for the day when you don't have any electricity coming from wind or sun. So it's a complex system of renewable electricity, and the transition's starting to happen. 2010, before the Fukushima nuclear accident, Germany was getting about 2% of its electricity from photovoltaics, 3% from water, 5.5% from biomass, and 6% from wind. So the renewable mix before Fukushima was about 17%. I talked about 1990 before, when all of this kind of began. In 1990, it was only 3%. So 3% to 17%, not bad. But take a look at this. 2 years later, or 3 years later, at the end of 2013, Germany had 23% of its electricity from renewables. So the Fukushima nuclear accident has had a real push in Germany to further expand renewables. And this is the trend we're now starting to see. This is the reliance on nuclear energy, and this is the reliance that we have on renewables. So we're starting to see the first part of the transition where nuclear is being replaced by renewables. What hasn't yet started to happen, and this is part of a problem we need to figure out, is something that's happened is we've been using more coal in the last years than before. Here you'll see we were using, let me do some quick math here, about 44% of the electricity was coming from coal, and that's more than it was in 2010. So part of the transition still needs to be worked on. Next reason. Why is the Energiewende happening? I've already told you about the rising costs of fossil fuels. I mentioned the climate change problem. But what about the young people in the room? Germany's got one of the same problems Russia has. It's got a declining population. It's got a population that's getting older. How do you make your economy attractive to the next generation? How do you make your economy attractive to new businesses? How do you make yourself the place people want to be? That's a lot of what's motivating the energy transition in Germany as well. It's not all about wind parks and solar. If it was, it would not be all that exciting. The energy transition is about transition in just about every part of your economy. Think about it. You use energy in your home for cooking, for heating. You use energy in your cars for driving. You use energy to make products. You use energy to do agriculture. You use energy in everything. If you want to do an energy transition, you need to think about a system. You need to think about how do we change this entire system in a direction that's low carbon, green, friendly, clean. And that's part of what's motivating the transition now in Europe. And maybe it's really important to know that although the national government set these targets, it set them in part in response to transitions that were happening already at the local level and in cities. If those transitions hadn't begun at the bottom level, I don't think we would be having the transition we're having now. So there's a lot of talk about energy transition as a form of green growth, energy transition as a way of creating new jobs, energy transition as a way of new forms of innovation. Some of you in your programs are thinking about urban cities, telecommunications, about what can be done with electronics. you're not going to succeed in an energy transition if you don't start to think about how can our cities become smart cities. How do we use our resources efficiently? How do you reduce the amount of waste? How do you actually take waste and make it into a resource? How do you communicate? I heard one of the urban innovation ideas from one of the students here was about how do you figure out when the buses are going to actually arrive? If you know when the bus is going to come, maybe you'll take the bus instead of drive your own car. What kinds of transitions can we think of to make our cities a lot smarter than they are today? Probably one of the best ways to do an energy transition to start it is to think about how do we reduce the amount of waste. We waste so much energy in our economies. The energy goes out the windows, it goes out the roofs. It is used in machines that use far more energy than they need to. What can we do to start to reduce that waste? The building sector is about 40% of energy use in a society. Energy transition isn't going to happen unless we do more to make our cities more energy efficient. Maybe this is also a good way to create jobs, because if you need to modernize a building, you need a lot of people to work. If you're going to put more insulation, you need people to put that insulation into the building. This is a map of Germany, and it's a colorful map because the map shows you different regions in Germany that have decided they're going to become renewable regions or climate-friendly regions. The dark blue regions are regions that are already 100% renewable energy regions. They've already made it. The light blue are ones that are on their way to becoming 100% renewable regions. They have the target, they're on the process of getting there. The pink regions are regions that are saying we're not trying to do 100% renewable, but we're trying to become climate friendly. Often they're regions that have cities, and cities are harder. You can't, St. Petersburg's never going to become 100% renewable. You can't do it for a city this big. The northwest of Germany, the area where North Rhine-Westphalen is, the North Rhine-Westphalen in English, is a region that was a steel region, lots of coal mining. It's a region that has been experiencing industrial decline, where companies have been closing down, where unemployment is getting higher, where you have more and more problems with how do we find jobs for the coal miners as the coal mines shut down. And there's some very interesting projects there. One is in the city of Bottrop. Bottrop is a very small city, but it's in the middle of the steel belt in Germany. And it has been experiencing a loss of jobs. It expects in 2016 that it's going to lose another 6,000 jobs when the coal mines in the area shut down. The whole region is nervous. And just like this class did when they started to think about Kronstadt, what can we do for Kronstadt? The city of Bottrop started to think, what can we do for our future? And they've focused on the idea of the Energiewende and saying, we're going to be a first mover on the Energiewende. And even though it's not a region where you're going to get a lot of renewable energy, they want to lead in the transition by focusing on what can be done with making our city a very high energy efficiency city. And maybe it's possible to attract young people to the city by establishing a new college, a college for the energy transition. Bringing new people and new ideas into the region in order to make a transition. The energy transition is also something that needs and should be a regional project. It shouldn't just be a German project, and it's not. Norway is already 100% renewable in its electricity sector. I think Norway is a very interesting example for Russia to think about. Norway is an oil-rich giant, a gas-rich giant. Norway is a little bit like the Saudi Arabia of Europe, except it has a very different image than Saudi Arabia. What's the difference? Norway is investing its oil wealth and its gas wealth in the future. It has established a sovereignty fund where the profits, a percentage of the profits from oil and gas go into pension funds, the healthcare system, the educational system, and sustainability projects. So Norway, at the same time as being an oil-rich giant, is thinking about how can they be leaders in a transition to a climate-friendly society. It means that oil is not a curse. It's a question of how do you use your oil wealth wisely? How do you use your gas wealth wisely? And there's now a lot of questions about whether or not more cooperation can happen, where we link Norway, for all of the Dutch people in the room, you'll notice here you are, with Denmark and Germany and England, and create an energy grid, an electricity grid that allows you to share your renewable energy with one another. So on the day there's no wind in Germany, there's still wind in Norway, or there's wind in England. So cooperation at a regional level. Can we maybe do it at a European level? Is it maybe possible that we start thinking, moving beyond our own little countries to a European and maybe your Russian kind of future of cooperation with interconnections that allow us to further promote renewable energies? And I said before, this transition can't happen unless there's also still some fossil fuel in the mix. We still need the natural gas as a backup for this transition. So the question is, how do we do a transition in a wise and cooperative fashion? And I also want to be realistic and say it's not all easy. Not everybody wants a wind park in their backyard. Not everybody wants high voltage electricity grid lines in their backyard. In order to do a renewable energy transition, you need new infrastructure. And some of that infrastructure means high voltage grid lines. They are ugly. They are big. They're really big. They're not like most of the grid lines you see here. They're much taller, they're much bigger. So one of the big challenges is how do we win societal acceptance for the new infrastructure that's also necessary. Sometimes it means putting electric lines underground even though that's more expensive. Or it might mean having to find a different path for the electricity grid line. But this is a big challenge that we need to think about. So you can't do an energy transition without having the public on board, because otherwise you will have social opposition. And we have another problem we have to figure out in Germany. Maybe some of you have heard about the rising costs of electricity. And there's various reasons behind that. One of the reasons is that energy costs in general have been rising. Fossil fuel costs are rising. That's also contributing to higher prices. But part of the problem is we have a feed-in tariff for renewable energy that was designed at a time when there wasn't so much renewable energy in the system. And so there was a lot of support for photovoltaics. There was a lot of support, financial support to make it attractive for companies and individuals to invest in photovoltaics or in wind. That's okay when you don't have so much renewable in the mix. But when you have 25% renewable in the electricity mix, it starts to get expensive. And maybe Germany invested a little bit too much in photovoltaics. For a country that doesn't have so much sunshine, there was a really big investment in photovoltaics compared to wind. Germany has a lot more wind. So we have some design flaws in our policies that we need to think about. And those are some things that Germany is working on now. How do we redesign this feed-in tariff system so renewables remain affordable? Well, the other big challenge for Europe right now, or one of them, is the United States. And I think this is also going to be very interesting for Russia, to think about what do developments in the United States mean for the energy transition in Europe? And what kind of energy transition is going on in the United States? The United States, until recently, was facing some of the same problems as Europe. Not as badly, but the United States was becoming an energy importer. US crude oil imports were increasing. 1950s, it was exporting. In the early 2000s, it was already importing a lot of crude oil. So in the US, there was also growing concern about rising fossil fuel prices and rising dependency on energy imports. It's nice and quiet now. And Germany had a new energy plan in 2010. The United States also introduced an energy plan in 2005 in response to those rising concerns about energy imports. The US plan in 2005 looks a little bit different than the European plans or the German plans. The focus is more on developing fossil fuels in the US in addition to renewable energy and energy efficiency. And maybe some of you have heard that in the United States there's this shale gas revolution going on, also known as fracking. Maybe I can just quickly ask, how many of you are familiar with what fracking is?
To what extent?
Okay, it's enough to know many of you don't. So let me just tell you a little bit about what fracking is. When you drill for oil or gas conventionally, what you do is you drill straight down. And with hydraulic pressure, the gas and the oil comes up. Fracking is a similar but different concept. You drill down, and then you drill horizontally. And you drill horizontally into shale rock. Because in the rock, there are pockets of gas or oil. And you pressure water into the well, and also chemicals. The chemicals are there to break up the rock and release the gas and release the oil, which then comes up. And the fracking is very, very long. So the horizontal drill can be 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers long. It's a very, very big drilling practice. When you frack for gas, you don't have one well, you have lots and lots of wells. So when you're fracking, you drill it, you go down, and you're in and out in 6 months' time. It goes very fast, but you have lots and lots of these drilling holes. In 2005, when the US passed its Energy Policy Act, there's one little clause that was put in there, and it amazes me that the environmental groups didn't scream when this act was passed. My guess is the environmental groups didn't know what fracking was, because there is an exemption in the US Energy Policy Act for fracking so that it doesn't have to have an environmental impact assessment. So the fracking that is going on, it's a loophole in a law that got through because nobody paid attention. And so the reason in the United States we have had this very dramatic shift towards more shale gas so fast is in part because the law has made it possible to do this without the impact assessments we would otherwise have expected. That is now something that is being changed in the US because of the concerns many people have about the chemicals in the water. What does it mean for drinking water? Is it safe? Is there methane release from the gas wells that is dangerous for climate change? So I think this loophole will slowly be corrected, but nevertheless it was there. Shale gas is part of what's going on in the United States. The other part of what's going on is an administration that is much more interested in the same kind of transition that Europe is having. The Obama administration is very interested in pushing renewable energy, pushing energy efficiency, in part also because the United States, in some regions like California or New York or maybe Florida, they're also concerned about long-term economic competitiveness. California is very much like Germany. California imports most of its energy. California is a high-tech region. And one of the questions California has is, how do you remain economically competitive? How do you deal with climate change? Just like Germany, you try to do an energy transition. You push renewables, you push energy efficiency. That's the kind of policy the Obama administration is also trying to push, but with a US Congress that's not always cooperating. So the US Congress has more focus on the fracking and the shale gas, and the Obama administration would be more interested in a European kind of transition. What about nuclear energy? The United States is the world's largest nuclear energy state. It has 104 nuclear power plants. Just to compare, Germany still has 9 nuclear plants in the mix. So the US has many, many more nuclear power plants. France has 59 nuclear power plants. Japan, before Fukushima, had 54, now it has 48. So the US is big in nuclear, and the Obama administration was also pursuing nuclear before Fukushima. Since Fukushima, they don't talk about nuclear power anymore. And I think there's 2 reasons. One is that shale gas has become so much cheaper that nuclear energy is too expensive. So there's not much new investment in nuclear right now. And maybe the other reason is Fukushima itself and concerns about environmental protest. So nuclear hasn't been given up in the United States in the way it has been in Germany or Switzerland or Denmark, but it's not really being pursued right now. What are we seeing in the United States? We are seeing an energy transition that is happening, but it's for more mixed reasons. So in 2009, or since 2009, US oil imports have fallen by almost half. And natural gas imports by about 60%. So right now there is talk about whether the United States will replace Saudi Arabia as the world's largest oil and gas producer. This has a lot of implications also here in Russia right now, and certainly in Europe. And I think one of the issues, I'll be quite honest, when I came to Russia, I thought, this is a challenging time to be coming to Russia, given the discussions in foreign relations right now and developments in the Ukraine. And I actually think it's a very important time to be coming to Russia, because it's exactly now that we need to be talking to each other. We need to be thinking about how do we move forward. I think on the energy question, we have to be very careful to maintain conversations, because this is an area where there's a lot of potential for cooperation between Europe, between Russia. But we should also be thinking about, can that cooperation be cooperation that moves in the direction of a planet that is faced by many big challenges? And certainly what we're hearing right now is that the US and Canada are interested in exporting more oil and gas to Europe as well. So it's another transition that's happening, and how we react to it is going to be very important. Just very quickly, to give you an idea of what shale gas means, these are shale gas regions in the United States. 2 weeks ago, I was here in the Marcellus Shale region in the United States. And in a period of about 7 years, they have put in several 100,000 of wells in this region. So it's a huge transition that's going on. This is also a region, it's a little bit like the Bottrop region in Germany, the North Rhine-Westphalen region, of steel companies and coal mines that were going in decline. And the shale gas revolution is certainly impacting the region. California, you'll notice, isn't part of this region. So I assume that what's going to go on, California is going to continue, like Germany, on a transition to turn its energy system into a renewable energy system, whereas this region and this region are going to be more fossil fuel tied. So here we see what was going on, US oil production dropping, now increasing. And what's kind of interesting is also which states are really involved. I don't know if you have ever heard of the state of North Dakota. North Dakota is north. It's cold. It's the Siberia of the United States. North Dakota has a population of less than 1 million people. So its population is smaller than your city. But it is now one of the larger producers of shale gas. So we're seeing some real changes in regional economies because of the shale gas revolution. And yeah, that's US changing its role. What does this mean in terms of US energy consumption? Coal has been a big part of US energy. It seems like natural gas is now going to take a bigger part. But it's also interesting to see that renewable energy is also part of the mix. So there is also a transition towards more renewable energy in the US, even though the US is a fossil fuel society. What is this going to mean in terms of the international climate negotiations? I don't know if you realize the Kyoto Protocol finished in 2012. It actually still continues. There's a Kyoto Protocol Phase 2 right now. It goes from 2013 to 2020, but nobody is part of the Kyoto Protocol anymore. It's basically Europe and I believe Australia. So the Kyoto Protocol, it's sort of there but not. And we're now in the process of trying to develop a global agreement on climate. The United States has very recently, in February of this year, introduced this set of ideas into the international community. An agreement that mitigation needs to happen, that all countries should have a plan for how they plan to reduce their emissions, that there should be a common time frame, there should be specific contributions, measurable commitments, and financing for projects. What does this say to me? It says to me the United States, much more than in the case of the Kyoto Protocol, is interested in talking about a global agreement, but the door is still very wide open for what kind of agreement. It's easier for the United States to do this now because its greenhouse gas emissions are starting to decline. So whereas before in Europe, emissions were declining because of renewable energy and energy efficiency improvements. In the US, it's the mix of energy efficiency, renewables, and shale gas that have emissions declining. The reasons are different, but it does open the door for maybe a little bit more cooperation. I think an important question will be is what's Russia's position going to be on the climate negotiations? And I feel like I've been talking too long, but I still have a little bit to say about Japan. Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. Japan. Japan is in an even more difficult situation than Europe or Germany. Japan has to import 98% of its oil. It imports almost all of its fossil fuels, and it imports just about everything else too, because Japan is a volcanic island. It doesn't have a whole lot of resources. And Japan recognizes that it too has been a pretty active player on climate change. Because Japan has to import so much oil and gas, coal, energy efficiency has always been very important to the country. And Japan has been one of the most energy efficient countries, especially in the industrial sector, not so much in the housing sector. So Japan has had a big push on energy efficiency, but it also, wait a minute, in the Kyoto Protocol period, Japan was host to the Kyoto Protocol. It's the only international agreement at this time in history that had a Japanese name. International agreements have the names of cities. And so Japan was very proud to have the Kyoto Protocol tied to its country. And Japan committed to reduce its emissions by 6% of 1990 levels, which was actually a big commitment given that Japan was already the world's most energy efficient country at the time. So Japan was a pretty serious player. They introduced a program. I like this. I like to be a salesperson for this program. It's called the Top Runner Program. You're supposed to run to the top of Mount Fuji. Not really. The Top Runner Program is a program that says when a product is designed, you have lots of different washing machines. The washing machine that is the most energy efficient washing machine gets the award, and the standard, the energy efficiency level of that washing machine becomes the standard that all other washing machines have to have in the next 4 years. So there's constant upward competition for the most energy efficient appliance. And they've been expanding this program, so now it's not just a washing machine or a PowerPoint projector or a computer. It's also starting to be buildings. Do you have the high energy efficiency building? Or processes. So it's a really neat idea that puts competition among companies that forces you towards more energy efficiency by requiring all companies to meet the highest standard in a few years' time. The other thing Japan did was the same thing as France, which is to try to become a nuclear energy power. So back in 1970, Japan had almost no nuclear energy, and it pushed. And its goal before the Fukushima nuclear accident was to be getting 50% of its electricity from nuclear energy. This plan was also part of the climate change plan for Japan as an effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, shift away from coal imports and oil imports, and use more nuclear power. But when Fukushima happens in your own country, it challenges this kind of plan. So Japan no longer has a goal for 50% nuclear energy, And in fact, right now, there's a huge debate in Japan about whether or not nuclear energy should continue. The Abe government has recently said they want to put nuclear power back on the line, but there's still a lot of opposition from local communities. So Japan had 54 nuclear power plants before Fukushima. 6 were damaged, 4 were damaged in the Fukushima accident, and the 2 other reactors in Fukushima, they've all been shut down. Of the remaining 48, about 20 are pretty old. My guess is they're going to be shut down. And then the question is, how many of the remaining 20 nuclear power plants, or 25, will continue, and for how long? So Japan's future is also shifting away pretty strongly from nuclear, even though they might not phase out nuclear energy. And then this is for you guys, the young people in the room. This is the cool part of Japan's response to climate change and energy import problems. They said we need a cultural change. We need to get people to dress to meet the weather. I don't know if you've noticed, but Asian traditions are sometimes a little conservative. All the men wear black suits and neckties, even when it's 40 degrees centigrade outside. And they started a campaign. This is the Japanese Prime Minister of the time, Koizumi, who's putting on summer shirts. And now in all government offices in the summer, it's actually a requirement not to wear ties and not to wear suits, so that you can keep the air conditioning temperature a little bit lower and not have to use as much energy. Japan is also trying an energy transition a little bit like Germany, although at this time it was thinking about doing it with nuclear energy. In 2009, Japan said it wanted to cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 1990. So Japan, too, is thinking about how to become a leader in green energy, in energy efficiency, in low-carbon cities. The Fukushima accident has impacted this plan a little bit, actually quite a lot, because without the nuclear energy, the 25% target is not achievable for Japan. So there is now a new target, which is a minus 3% target of 2005 levels. So actually Japan is planning to increase its emissions a little bit compared to 1990 levels. But for a country that doesn't protest, Fukushima led to protest. So we are seeing some real changes in Japan as well. And for the international climate negotiations, I think what we're going to see is a shift away from a system where Japan was doing 6%, the EU 8%, the US 7%, and then the US pulled out. I think we're now going to have a system where the focus is going to be much more on how do we establish targets that move us in the direction of transition, but also help us to establish green economies. What have we seen so far? The EU had its 20-20-20 goals in Copenhagen. I think in Paris, it's probably going to be something like 40-30 or something like that. The United States introduced a 17% cut for 2020. I can't tell you what the US will do in Paris, but in Copenhagen they were talking about a 42% cut by 2030. And Japan is changing. Japan is now saying emission reductions probably can't happen. To end things, the energy transitions are also all very important in the climate negotiations. They're a real big question in terms of what's going to happen in Paris in 2015. But it's really very important because the next international agreement will help push states along in the direction of more energy transition or not. So my hope is that in 2015, more countries will agree to the idea that being smart with energy means being more green with energy and moving towards an energy transition. And that was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Miranda, for a wonderful lecture, very interesting. Уважаемые коллеги, я думаю, что теперь настало время для ваших вопросов, и я попрошу вас задавать вопросы, обязательно представляясь и называя вашу организацию или университет и так далее. Пожалуйста.
А спрашивать по-английски или по-русски?
Нет, спрашивать можно по-русски, потому что у нас синхронный перевод, у нас есть переводчики, и они с удовольствием переведут вам, а Миранда в наушниках, значит, она будет. Сейчас, одну секундочку.
Олег Бодров, неправительственная экологическая организация «Зеленый мир», атомный город Сосновый Бор. У меня вопрос. Скажите, какие главные барьеры внутри Германии для продвижения возобновляемой энергетики и энергоэффективности? И какие главные барьеры внешние по отношению к Германии, которые могут замедлить этот процесс?
Thank you. I think that there's no single barrier. Probably the biggest challenge with energy transition is public understanding and acceptance. And I think the energy transition in Germany has actually been going on for about 30 years. So it began already in the 1970s with local protests against nuclear power, and in the early 1990s with the first efforts to do renewable energy and growing emphasis on energy efficiency. So it's been a long transition, and there was a lot of opposition at first. There was opposition to changing the status quo, and you can understand that. People have jobs, they feel threatened, so part of it was also showing people that there are other alternatives, that doing things differently isn't just a threat, it's also a chance. And I think that there's been a lot of learning. I think now one of the challenges is that the transition is in a new phase. It's no longer starting, it's now really in the middle of a transition. And renewables are no longer a small part of the energy mix, they're a big part. So now the renewables have to behave also like an industry that doesn't have so much subsidies. So the next transition is going to be towards making the renewables more competitive, but also to continue societal acceptance and to tell people, to convince people that it makes a difference if you ride a bicycle or if you use public transportation. But the challenges are big because there are, of course, many interests that prefer the status quo.
So you answer about the problem inside of the Germany, but what about the barrier which is outside?
Yeah, the challenge is outside. Well, for Germany, one of the big challenges is that Germany is part of the European Union. And Germany is therefore part of a European market, also a European electricity and gas market. And not all European neighbors have the same vision as Germany, so that's certainly a challenge. And the other challenge, for example, right now, the shale gas from the United States. With the cheaper gas prices in the United States, there are companies in Germany that are saying, this is a problem for our competitiveness. And how can we pay for the more expensive renewables right now if gas is so cheap in the United States? But I think there's also answers to that. And the answers, one, are that the shale gas in the US is probably not going to stay so cheap. And two, that it will have consequences we haven't seen yet, the environmental problems that come with shale gas. And three, that in the long run, you still have a problem that shale gas is a limited resource. And then Germany may pay more now, but it's like an investment in an education for your child. You do it so that your child has an economic chance in the future. And I think that's part of the response to this challenge.
My name is Mikhail Maloshenko. I'm from St. Petersburg State University, and I would like to ask you, what do you think can prompt countries or country groups that do not have shared borders to collaborate in pushing forward this renewable energy transit, this sustainable development transit? Except for some ideas like fighting against global change, something more concrete.
If you ask me, this trend is a global trend. And even though there's going to be a lot of pressure against the green transition, I think you can't stop it. And you can't stop it because it's happening everywhere. I'm in China a lot. China is doing so much right now in terms of transforming its cities in the direction of green cities and smart cities. And they have to. You've got 1 billion people, and they don't have enough energy either. So they're doing it because it makes a lot of sense. I also think that that's where the new technologies are going to be. The old industries are not going to be economically so competitive in the long run. It's the new industries that are going to be the places that are energy efficient, resource efficient, but also technologically cutting edge. So I think that investment money is also going to go in the direction of these new investments, even though there will be ups and downs in the process. And there will be times the process goes faster, and then sometimes there'll be backlash. But I think it's a trend that's going to be hard to stop. When I listened to the urban group upstairs, I was thinking, you guys are in the middle of your own transition. You are trying to figure out how do you do a transition here in St. Petersburg. You found yourself an island that has some really big challenges, and you're starting there. And that's exactly the way you do it. You take the first step. And somebody else is going to see that. I bet that this new project, this new MA program you have, is going to be watched by other schools, and they're going to say, we want something like that too. It looks like fun. So that's what I think.
My name is Pavel Vishnyakov. I'm from Leningrad Regional University. My question is, what do you think the biggest transnationals, oil and gas, think about all that? And especially also from our country, as you know, that the Gazprom and other Rosneft, which are, I don't think that they are happy with all this trend you've been mentioning.
I would say, don't worry too much. Why? Because we have a planet of 7 billion people that's going to be 9 billion people pretty soon. There's going to continue to be a lot of demand for oil and gas and coal. And energy transition does not mean that we are not going to use oil and gas and coal. But I think it's also a lesson to the transnational companies that you have to look to the future and not just stick to the past. There is no industry that has more money than the fossil fuel industry. If that fossil fuel industry were to invest just a little bit more in renewables, the potential for expansion would be terrific, and they are going to be complementary sources for a long time, because there's no way we can do renewables for everybody in the next 30 years. And in 30 years' time, there isn't going to be as much oil and gas or coal anymore, so we're going to have that transition well in place. So I would say, the companies that are going to do the best in 10 or 20 or 30 years are those that are going to be diversified companies, and that in addition to doing the oil or the gas, are also investing in new technologies and processes. I think there again, Norway is a very interesting example.
Еще вопросы, пожалуйста.
Большое спасибо за очень интересное выступление. Такой вопрос. Вот насколько сейчас, ну, по крайней мере, некоторое время назад в Европе широко обсуждались такие концепции, как третья промышленная революция Джереми Ривкина. Вот. И сейчас уже больше в Великобритании обсуждается такая концепция, как циклическая экономика, circular economy. Вот. И, соответственно, хотелось бы знать вообще, насколько сейчас вот именно эти сюжеты более системные, да, не ограничивающиеся только энергетикой, находят какое-то свое продвижение в плане принятия решений на общеевропейском или на уровне конкретных государств. Спасибо.
Thank you for mentioning those concepts. The idea of a circular economy that basically says rather than manufacturing products and then producing emissions from the production process and having waste, all end products, all outputs become new resources for new products. So you basically try to create a system with no waste. That idea, or the green economy idea, are right now at the heart of a lot of European discussions in the European Commission. Europe has plans for how to improve resource efficiency, not just energy efficiency. And I think everything I said about energy today, we could have the same conversation and take out the word energy and put in the word resources and have the same discussion. Basically, it's not only a question of how do we deal with limited fossil fuel resources, it's also a question how do we deal with limited resources on the planet. And we really need to transition economies towards economies that recognize that there are planetary boundaries, that there are limits to how much we can take out of the ground, there are limits to how much forests we can cut down, there are limits to how much pollution we can put into the air or the oceans. So in response to your question, yes, there are policies in Europe for resource efficiency, for circular economy, for green economy, for energy efficiency. But I will say there's still many challenges. So Europe is talking in the right direction. We still need to do more on the implementation front. I don't want to say that Europe has it all figured out. There's still a lot of challenges too.
Thank you. One more question. Any other questions?
My name is Klim. I'm from Center of Strategic Development, Northwest, and I got a question about smart grid. You've mentioned some smart things, you know, like renewable energy sources, energy efficiency, maybe, and even this energy ring between the countries. But I think that the way of interconnection among these smart things are not so smart. What I mean? I mean that the grid, the goal of interconnection, maybe it could be called stupid. It's like not so modern. And I got a question, does Germany have any phases or some time stamps of introducing this smart grid program, and how does the German government think, what does German government think about this concept?
Thank you. I think your question might be about these high voltage grids also. Do we really need them? Not completely. There's a lot of debate in Germany, actually. I'm going to start with that part and say there's a lot of debate in Germany. Do we need so much high voltage grid? Maybe we can do more transition decentralized. So have more regional energy developments. You still have the challenge in the German case that wind is in the north and industrial production is in the south. So you probably need to get some electricity from north to south. But maybe it's possible to do more decentralized. That links to your question about smart grids, because if we can use energy more efficiently, we don't need as much new infrastructure. So yes, there are smart grid projects in some German cities. The challenges are still big on the technology front. And there's also, in the German case, a lot of concern about data protection. Because if you know when I do my wash, or you know when I do my cooking, then you also know if I'm at home or not. And so there are some data questions that are considered with smart grids. I think it's more of a technology challenge, though, because when I hear about smart grids, what I hear these days is, imagine your refrigerator is a battery, and that your refrigerator only turns on when there's a lot of wind. And then it stores very cold temperature in the refrigerator when it's no wind outside. And then it uses that cold temperature. So it becomes a smart refrigerator. Maybe you can have a smart washing machine. The washing machine only turns on when there's a lot of sunshine. But we haven't figured out yet beyond that. And I think that's where we need people who think outside of the box. This is the challenge for the next generation of young people. You've got to think differently than our generation has been thinking, so that you come up with new ideas that we're not seeing yet. For how can we do these things more smartly? Maybe I can just throw in one last thing. I know you're tired of listening to me, but you know, another thing that some young people have come up with is the idea of car sharing. Why does everybody need their own car? How about if we have one car and we share it, right? Then you'd have fewer cars on the streets in St. Petersburg. And it would be cheaper for everybody. That kind of idea came from young people. And now we have shared car systems moving all around the world. It's an idea that's taken off like this. So we need people who think out of the box and say, I've got a good idea, and it'll make a small difference. It'll make our lives more comfortable, but it's also more energy efficient.
Пожалуйста, еще вопросы? Есть ли еще вопросы? Maybe Miranda, you would like to ask questions to the audience. Yeah. You're interested in some ideas.
What do you want for Russia's future? Where do you see Russia's energy system going? Use a brave soul.
Okay, I am quite liberal as far as energy resources are concerned, and I believe that any state, regardless whether it has mineral resources that it can use or not, should develop renewable energy, just because it is better for our future generations. I mean, all these fossil fuels may someday vanish. So they are not endless. And in this respect, it is much better to develop solar energy or hydropower, etc. So I believe that Russia has to implement some changes in its energy grid.
Do you all agree?
Any discussion? Кто-то хочет что-то?
Russia is unpredictable.
Russia is unpredictable. Да, пожалуйста.
Я из ИПРО, из этого института. И я хотела спросить, почему вы считаете, вы сказали, что американский газ дешевый. Почему вы считаете, что он дешевый? Я слышала, что себестоимость добычи газа, сланцевого газа в Америке, она гораздо более дорогая, чем добыча традиционного газа в России. Кроме того, из России есть труба, а американский газ, он не придет к вам по воздуху. Надо строить инфраструктуру. Сегодня я видела такие данные, американские экономисты подсчитали, что Евросоюз должен будет затратить около 213 миллиардов долларов на создание инфраструктуры для экспорта газа.
I think you are right that there's already the infrastructure between Russia and Europe. I do think there are economic interests in the United States that would like to sell the natural gas, whether it's to Europe or to Asia, they don't care. I think it's an important issue right now because of the tensions that exist between Russia and the West, Russia, Europe, and the United States right now over the Ukraine. I think that's why we really need dialogue to think about where do we go in the future and how do we work together in the future. If tensions become worse, then it could lead to a decision to look more to the US. If tensions relax, then I don't think that will happen. So I think we need to work towards relaxing tensions and think about how we try to create some visions together. And I'll be honest, having lived in Europe now for 7-8 years, I think there's not enough discussion about the relationship between Europe and Russia. When we are in Europe and we're talking about the future of Europe, very often there's a map. It's a Eurasian map. But you only see the European countries interconnected. And the Russian connection is not so often made. And I actually think we need to think more about what can we do to integrate, especially the western part of Russia, more tightly into developments so that Russia feels a part of the community. So I do think there's things we need to work on.
Thank you very much, Миранда. Я очень рада, что мы закончили именно на этой замечательной ноте, потому что завтра у нас запланировано еще одно интересное событие. Это дискуссия за круглым столом по вопросам сотрудничества России и Европейского Союза в области низкоуглеродной энергетики. И за круглым столом будет выступление Миранды. И будут выступления наших экспертов из Санкт-Петербурга, представляющих совершенно различные организации, и некоммерческие организации, и государственные организации, и так далее. Так что мы продолжим эту дискуссию завтра. Я хочу поблагодарить от вашего имени Миранду за очень интересное выступление, за то, что она была здесь с нами. Я хочу поблагодарить аудиторию за вопросы и интерес, пригласить всех на первый этаж в нашем кафе. Для вас организован кофе-брейк. И после кофе-брейка через 30 минут мы снова здесь собираемся с журналистами и всеми заинтересованными коллегами послушать ответы Миранды на вопросы журналистов. И я надеюсь, что вы будете активными участниками наших последующих встреч, дискуссий и событий. Большое спасибо, Миранда. И большое спасибо участникам за ваш интерес и ваше присутствие здесь.